The night I realized the sea could keep secrets was the night it almost swallowed me whole. Its roar felt like a heartbeat too large for the earth, and I stood on the shore feeling smaller than the shadow of a gull. The wind tangled through my hair, as if whispering something forbidden, something I wasn't meant to understand. And in that moment, I knew my life was made of water and silence, of things taken and never returned. That was the night I began to hide my first secret from the waves, the secret of a dream I couldn't even name yet. I was born in a hut that smelled of salt and smoke, where every morning began with the groan of wooden boats being dragged across wet sand. My father was a man carved by the ocean, his skin dark from the sun, his words brief and hard. He believed in two things only: the strength of his nets and the mercy of the tide. My mother moved quietly through that life, mending nets, washing scales from her hands, humming songs older than memory. Between them, I existed like a ghost that had forgotten its own language. In our village, reading was a luxury meant for strangers. We measured days, not in hours, but in tides, and nobody cared for words that couldn't mend a boat or feed a mouth. I had never touched a book. I had only seen them from a distance, leather-bound mysteries in the hands of travelers who passed through our shore. They spoke softly when they read, as though their voices were spells that could calm storms, and I used to watch them with a hunger that embarrassed me. I would imagine that somewhere inside those pages lived a world where girls like me didn't smell of fish or fear. But that kind of wanting was dangerous in a place that worshipped simplicity. My father said dreaming was for people who didn't have work to do. He often looked at me with tired eyes, wondering if I'd ever learn to live like the sea demanded. Strong, silent, unfeeling. So I buried my questions, the way fishermen bury anchors beneath the water. Heavy, hidden, necessary. I thought if I ignored the ache long enough, it might drown quietly inside me. Then, one morning after a storm, the tide betrayed its promise of sameness. I was walking the beach collecting fragments the waves had returned, shells, driftwood, bits of net, when my foot struck something soft, half buried in the sand. I knelt and brushed it free, expecting seaweed or cloth, but what I lifted was heavier, colder, alive in a way I couldn't explain. It was a book. Its cover was swollen from the salt, the spine warped and bent, but the pages clung together stubbornly, refusing to surrender. I turned it over in my hands, watching droplets slide down its edges, and for a moment the morning seemed to still around me. The gulls stopped crying. The wind hesitated. Even the sea waited. I couldn't read a single word, yet the symbols on the page drew me closer, each line a mystery written for someone smarter, braver, freer than me. I pressed the book to my chest and felt my heart answer it like an echo. I knew I should throw it back into the water. Anything the sea returned, it demanded back eventually. But I couldn't. It was as if this ruined, half-drowned thing was the proof that another life existed. A life measured in stories instead of storms. I looked toward the horizon where the sky met the sea, and realized I wanted to cross that invisible line more than anything. I slipped the book under my shawl and hurried home before anyone could see. My hands trembled as I hid it beneath my bed, between the ropes and the drying nets. All day, I worked beside my father pretending nothing had changed, but the weight of that hidden book burned against my ribs like a secret flame. That night, when everyone slept, I pulled it out again and opened it under the moonlight. The letters shimmered faintly, half dissolved but still alive, and I traced them with the tip of my finger, whispering sounds I didn't understand, believing somehow the pages would hear me. I don't know how long I sat there before the creak of the door split the quiet. The smell of seawater and smoke filled the room. My father's shadow spread across the floor, tall and certain. I froze, the book open in my lap, moonlight catching the wet pages. His gaze fell on it, and then on me, and I saw in his face not anger, but a kind of fear. The fear of losing something he didn't know how to hold. He walked forward slowly, his boots thudding like the surf against rocks, and without a word, he took the book from my hands. He turned it once, studying it the way men study storms, measuring its threat. Then, in a voice softer than I'd ever heard, he said, "You'll drown chasing words that don't belong to you." He dropped it into the hearth, where the flames caught the wet pages and hissed like snakes. The room filled with the smell of burning salt and ink, the light flickering over his face until I couldn't tell whether the fire was inside the pit or inside me. I stood there, my hands empty, watching the pages curl and vanish, each one carrying away the story I might have lived. My father turned and walked into the dark, leaving the door wide open to the night wind. The sea roared in the distance, as if it too had seen what he'd done. And in that sound, that endless voice of the waves, I made a vow I didn't dare speak aloud. If the sea wanted its secret back, it would have to fight me for it. The fire's glow still burned in my memory long after the flames had died. The smell of ash and salt seemed to cling to my skin, a reminder that dreams could be destroyed as easily as paper. I sat awake that night, listening to the waves crash against the shore, each one sounding like my father's voice, steady, relentless, certain that the sea would always win. When dawn finally came, it felt less like morning and more like judgment. The ashes from the burnt book still lay scattered near the hearth, faint and gray, against the blackened wood. I swept them up slowly, my fingers trembling, afraid that even touching what was left of it would make him angry again. But there was something sacred in those ashes, a quiet defiance that refused to die. Every piece that crumbled between my fingertips felt like a piece of me, too fragile to save, but too important to forget. My father moved around the house in silence that morning. His shoulders were hunched, his breath heavy, as if the night had taken something from him as well. I wanted to believe he'd burned the book because he was scared for me, scared that I'd want a life the sea couldn't give. But when he finally spoke, his words came out like stones thrown into deep water. "Books don't feed families," he said, not looking at me. "Stories don't keep boats afloat." I wanted to answer, to tell him that not everything that feeds us comes from the sea, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I just stood there, silent, watching him knot his ropes and prepare for the day's catch. He paused only once, glancing at me with something close to regret in his eyes. "You'll understand one day," he muttered, and stepped out into the gray light. The rest of the village learned what had happened before noon. I saw it in their smirks, in the way they whispered when I passed. "The fisherman's girl tried to read," they said, laughing. "What does she need books for? The sea's the only teacher she'll ever have." Their words stung worse than the salt wind. Every time someone laughed, I felt smaller, weaker, more foolish for believing I could be more than the life I'd been born into. But shame has a strange way of transforming into strength when no one is watching. That night, while the others drank and told stories around the fires, I walked to the edge of the pier and looked out at the dark horizon. I whispered to the waves, not prayers, not apologies, but promises. I told the sea that I would learn, even if it took my whole life. I would find the words that had been taken from me. I didn't know how, or when, or where, but I would. The sea could take my father's boat, my peace, even my name, but it would not take this promise. Days passed in silence between us. I helped him repair nets, mend sails, salt fish for the market. Every movement was mechanical, every word measured. He no longer scolded me, but the distance between us grew larger than the tide. Some nights I heard him talking in his sleep, muttering my mother's name, asking the sea to spare us from something unnamed. I realized then that his anger wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Fear that the world outside the waves would take me away from him, the way storms took boats. One afternoon, I sat by the docks, alone, tracing invisible letters on the planks, trying to remember the shape of the symbols I'd seen before the fire. I could still see them clearly in my mind. Black, elegant, full of secrets. The wind picked up, suddenly, carrying the scent of the deep ocean, and I closed my eyes to listen. For the first time, the sea didn't sound like warning. It sounded like waiting. I didn't know that the waiting was about to end. That night, as the sky bruised into dusk, I stood outside our cottage, the air heavy with fog. My father was late returning from the water, and the lamps by the docks flickered weakly against the mist. I wrapped my shawl tighter and stepped toward the shore, my thoughts heavy with worry and defiance. That was when I saw him. A figure standing at the edge of the pier, his coat dripping with sea spray, something glinting in his hand under the lantern light. He was a stranger, tall and quiet, his face shadowed beneath a hood. The wind caught his coat and whipped it open, and in his hands, I saw it. A book, waterlogged and worn, the same one my father had burned. My breath caught in my throat as he raised his eyes to meet mine, and for a heartbeat, everything inside me froze. He stepped closer, the waves lapping at his boots, and in a voice roughened by the sea, he said, "You dropped this once." My heart thundered against my ribs as he held the book out to me, its pages dripping but intact, as if it had been waiting beneath the waves for my return. Behind him, the ocean roared louder, and for the first time, I couldn't tell whether it was protecting me or warning me again. The night the stranger returned my burnt book was the night my fate changed. The pages were warped and salted, but as I ran my hand across them, I felt life still pulsing beneath the ruin, like a heartbeat trapped inside paper. I didn't know how the sea had given it back, nor why, but it felt like a sign that the ocean itself had surrendered a secret to me. By the next morning, I was no longer just a fisherman's daughter who couldn't read. I was a girl chosen by something greater than fear. When the stranger vanished with the dawn mist, the villagers called him a ghost. They said the sea sometimes sent spirits to confuse the living, to tempt them into danger. But I didn't care what they said. All I could think about was the book he'd returned. My father refused to look at it. He muttered a short prayer, spat into the water, and left for the boats without a word. I knew he was afraid, not of the sea, but of what the sea might be giving me. That morning, a new face appeared in the village, an old woman wearing a long gray coat and a scarf that flapped like a flag in the wind. Her hair was the color of driftwood, her eyes clear and watchful. She walked along the dock speaking softly to anyone who'd listen, offering lessons in reading and writing to whoever wished to learn. The men laughed at her. The women shook their heads. Nobody wanted words when fish could be caught instead. But I couldn't stop staring at her. The way she carried herself, the calmness in her gaze, as if she'd already survived the kind of storm that destroys most people. When she turned toward me, her eyes caught mine and didn't let go. "You look like someone who's searching," she said, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. I didn't answer, but the book in my hands said everything. She smiled, almost sadly. "Bring that to my cottage tomorrow," she said. "It's time someone taught you what it's trying to say." Her name was Mrs. Harper, a retired teacher who had once lost her husband and son to the sea. Some said she'd gone mad with grief. Others said she'd made peace with it. All I knew was that she carried herself like someone who had looked death in the face and refused to stop learning. Her cottage stood at the edge of the village, near the cliffs, a small house that always smelled faintly of tea and smoke. The first lesson was harder than hauling any net. The letters twisted and shifted before my eyes, lines and hooks that refused to settle. My tongue stumbled over words like they were stones lodged in my throat. I felt stupid, clumsy, smaller than I'd ever felt before. Mrs. Harper didn't laugh. She waited. Her patience filled the room like sunlight breaking through fog. "Every word you learn is a rescue," she told me gently. Some save others, some save you. She traced the letter A on my palm with her chalk-stained finger and made me repeat it again and again until it stopped feeling foreign. We practiced late into the afternoon, her voice steady, my heart uncertain, but alive. When I left that day, the book under my arm felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for me to unlock it all along. By the second lesson, the villagers had started whispering. Some called me cursed, others foolish. My father refused to speak to Mrs. Harper. He said she was filling my head with dangerous ideas, dreams that could drown me faster than the sea ever could. I didn't listen. Every evening, I walked up the cliff path to her cottage, my mind still echoing with the sound of letters taking shape inside me. She had a way of teaching that wasn't just about words. It was about seeing the world differently. When she spoke of books, her eyes softened as if she were remembering her lost family. "The sea takes," she said one afternoon, "but it never forgets. You just have to learn how to read what it leaves behind." I didn't understand her then, but I would soon. For 2 weeks, those lessons became my secret world, a place where my fear dissolved and something stronger began to take root. I practiced on scraps of paper, on sand, even on the inside of my palms. I dreamed in letters, woke up whispering words I hadn't yet mastered. For the first time in my life, the sound of the sea didn't scare me. It reminded me of Mrs. Harper's voice, calm, steady, infinite. But secrets never stay hidden for long in a village that feeds on gossip. One evening, while walking home, I overheard the fishermen talking near the tavern. They said the old woman had angered the sea, that teaching its children to read was a sin against nature. Someone had seen lightning strike near her cottage the night before, and called it a warning. I tried to laugh it off, but fear gnawed at me all night. The next morning, I set out for my third lesson early. The fog was thick, rolling in from the water like a living thing. I could barely see the cliffs as I climbed the path, my book pressed to my chest. When I reached the top, the smell hit me first, sharp and bitter, like iron and smoke. My stomach dropped before my eyes confirmed what my heart already knew. Mrs. Harper's cottage was gone. The roof had caved in, the windows shattered, the walls blackened and smoldering. The sea wind howled through the ruins, scattering ashes into the air like dark snow. I dropped to my knees, clutching the book against me, the edges cutting into my palms. The villagers said lightning had struck, that it was nature's punishment for meddling with things better left to scholars. But I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. As the smoke rose into the gray sky, I felt the sea watching me again, as if reminding me who was in control. And in that moment, as tears blurred the ashes, I swore that if the ocean wanted to test me, it would learn how dangerous a girl with words could become. The smoke had not yet cleared when I returned the next morning, the air still heavy with the scent of burnt wood and rain. The flames had eaten her books, but not her spirit. I could feel it before I even saw her. There, on the blackened sand where her cottage once stood, sat Mrs. Harper, calm, soot-stained, and impossibly alive, her hand moving across the ground with a stick, forming shapes that shimmered for a moment before the tide swept them away. "Fire takes paper," she whispered without looking up. "Not language." And just like that, the lessons began again. She did not mourn the lost pages. Instead, she treated the ashes like a new beginning. Each morning, we met by the shoreline, our feet sinking into the cool sand as gulls wheeled overhead. She would draw letters with her stick, slow and deliberate, while I copied them beside her, my fingers trembling with determination. The wind erased our work as quickly as we made it, but somehow that felt right. Every erased word meant we could start again without fear of failure. The beach became our classroom. The rhythm of the waves turned into our metronome, the steady pulse that guided our voices. "The sea erases," Mrs. Harper said, "but it also remembers. If you listen long enough, you'll hear it repeating what we've written." I began to believe her. Each time I traced a letter, it felt like carving my name into the world itself. Fragile, temporary, yet defiant. My progress was painfully slow. The letters tangled in my mind like the nets I used to mend for my father. Sometimes I would cry in frustration, the sound swallowed by the wind. But Mrs. Harper never lost her patience. "You're not learning to read," she told me once. "You're learning to forgive yourself for not knowing sooner." That sentence stayed with me long after the waves washed away our words. At home, things grew colder. My father refused to look at me when I entered the house. The villagers had begun to talk again, this time in hushed tones that carried further than they meant them to. "The old woman's cursed," they said. "She's teaching the fisherman's girl to summon storms with her letters." My mother avoided their eyes in the marketplace, but she didn't stop me. She would leave an extra piece of bread on the table before dawn, silent approval disguised as routine. Some evenings, when the sea turned red beneath the setting sun, I would catch Mrs. Harper staring at the horizon, her lips moving silently as if she were reciting something only the ocean could understand. When I asked what she was saying, she smiled faintly. "I'm speaking to my husband," she said. "He's somewhere out there, listening." That night, I dreamed of the sea whispering back in his voice, carrying words I didn't yet know how to read. Weeks passed, and slowly the letters began to make sense. I learned to spell sea, fish, home, and finally, hope. The first time I managed to read a full line from a rescued scrap of newspaper, Mrs. Harper clapped her hands and laughed, a sound so full of pride it almost broke me. For the first time in my life, I felt worthy of something greater than survival. But learning came with its own price. My father's silence hardened into anger. When he passed me at the table, he no longer called me daughter. He began to stay longer on the boats, sleeping there instead of coming home. Once I found him staring at my sandy notes near the door and saw his hands curl into fists before he turned away. The sea had always taken what it wanted, and now it was taking me, not through waves, but through words. Still, I couldn't stop. I met Mrs. Harper every day, no matter how heavy the wind, no matter how many whispers followed me down the path. She said storms were just lessons in disguise, and I wanted to believe her. On the night before my 15th lesson, the air grew strangely still, the waves quiet like they were waiting for something. I wrote my name in the sand one last time before leaving and promised her I'd return at sunrise. But when I reached home, my father was sitting outside in the dark, a lantern glowing beside him. He didn't speak as I passed, didn't even look at me, only held something tightly in his hands. It wasn't until I was halfway to my room that he finally called out my name, his voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. When I turned, he stood there in the doorway, the lantern light flickering across his face. In his hands was a folded piece of paper, damp, creased, and stained with salt. His eyes, normally so hard, were unsteady now, uncertain. He held the paper out toward me, his voice breaking as he said, "It came from the city. I can't read it." The letter shook in his hands like it carried more than words, like it carried fate. "Read it to me," he whispered. And as the sea roared outside, I felt the air tighten around us, the past and present colliding in that fragile moment when a father's silence met the daughter who had finally learned to speak. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the ink itself carried weight. My father's rough hands shook when he passed it to me, his eyes avoiding mine, his jaw set in a silence that said more than words ever could. I had spent months yearning to read, and now that the chance stood trembling before me, I was terrified of what it might reveal. The daughter who once begged for letters was suddenly the only one in the room who could face them, and for the first time, knowledge didn't feel like freedom. It felt like power, and power scared me. I unfolded the paper slowly, the smell of damp salt clinging to its creases. The words blurred for a moment. My pulse was pounding too loud to focus. But then they settled into meaning, line by line, sentence by sentence, until the truth hit like a wave that knocks you breathless. It was a government notice. Cold, official, merciless, taxes overdue, debts accumulated, and at the bottom, the line that turned my father's livelihood into dust. Fishing license revoked pending payment. I looked up at him, unsure whether to speak. He stared at the floor, waiting for my verdict the way a man waits for a storm to pass or destroy him. "It says they're taking the boat," I finally whispered. The words tasted like betrayal. He didn't move. For a long moment, all I heard was the sea outside, steady, indifferent. Then he said quietly, "Read it again." Each repetition was worse than the first. Every number, every signature, every demand etched itself deeper into my chest. When I finished, he sat down heavily, his hands covering his face. For years I had seen him fight the sea, wrestle with storms, curse the wind, but I had never seen him look defeated. That sight broke something in me. I went to Mrs. Harper the next morning, the letter clutched in my fist. She read it once and nodded, her eyes full of sorrow. "They never warn men like your father until it's too late," she said. "But maybe it isn't too late if you understand what they wrote." She made copies of the notice, spread them out across her small table, and began teaching me how to read numbers, dates, legal phrases. "Use this gift to rise, not to rebel," she told me. "Anger burns faster than fire, but understanding lasts." For days we pored over every word. I learned how to write a reply, how to fill forms, how to send petitions. Each evening I returned home to find my father repairing his nets in silence, pretending not to notice the government seal on the documents I carried. The villagers whispered that I was trying to fight men too powerful to see me. I didn't care. The more I read, the clearer it became that the debt wasn't just money. It was manipulation. The merchants who bought our fish had raised the fees quietly, trapping the fishermen one by one. I stayed up nights, reading every scrap I could find. The lantern light blurred my vision. The ink stained my fingertips. For the first time, I wasn't just learning for myself. I was learning to save us. When I brought the completed petition to my father, he refused to sign it. "No good comes from challenging people who own the sea," he said. But I could hear fear behind the words, not conviction. "Let me try," I pleaded. "If they see the mistake, they might let you keep the license." He stared at me for a long time, then turned away. "Do what you want," he muttered. "You already have." The letter was mailed that night, carried by a courier from the next town. I should have felt relieved, but instead a strange unease followed me home. Something in the numbers on that notice bothered me. The way the amounts changed from one page to the next, the signatures written in different inks. It was as if someone had tampered with the records. I couldn't shake it. I went back to Mrs. Harper's cottage with the papers, spreading them across her table again. Together we compared each copy, tracing dates and marks with trembling fingers. The discrepancy was small, but undeniable. A signature that shouldn't exist. A date that didn't match. Mrs. Harper looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Child, this isn't an error. Someone's done this on purpose." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My father's ruin wasn't just bad luck or unpaid debt. It was something darker. Someone had forged the documents that stole our right to the sea. I didn't know who, but the answer was buried somewhere inside the very system that had declared us powerless. That night, I sat by the window, the letter spread before me like a wound that refused to close. Outside, the tide rose high and fast, crashing against the rocks as if trying to warn me. My father slept in the next room, unaware that the truth I was chasing might break us both. I took the papers to the light one last time and saw what I hadn't noticed before. A faint seal embossed beneath the government mark, one that didn't belong to any official office. My hands went cold. The forgery wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it bore the symbol of someone from our own village. As the wind rattled the shutters, I realized the sea wasn't the only thing capable of betrayal, and the secret hidden beneath those papers was one I was never meant to find. I had spent my life believing that the sea was the only thing that could betray a fisherman, but betrayal wears many faces, some with hands that shake yours at the market, some with smiles that hide knives. The day I discovered the truth about my father's debts, the air itself seemed heavier, the sky lower, as if even the horizon knew what I was about to uncover. What I thought were storms of nature turned out to be storms of men, deliberate, cruel, calculated. My father hadn't been ruined by bad luck or rough tides. He had been drowned by another man's greed. It began with the mismatched signatures. I couldn't stop staring at them. The faint difference in slant, the uneven pressure of the ink. They weren't my father's hand. He signed with broad, certain strokes, the way he tied his nets, but the ones on the notice were hesitant, uneven, almost forced. I borrowed a lantern and went through every old document we had, receipts, contracts, fishing logs, and the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been forging his name for years, taking loans in it, selling catch that never existed, pocketing the profits while the blame fell squarely on him. The name at the top of each paper was the same: Gerald Pike, the wealthiest merchant in our village. He was the man everyone trusted, the one who bought fish from every family, who lent nets when storms destroyed them, who smiled with generosity that now felt poisonous. I could see it clearly, and yet the knowledge made me sick. If I exposed him, my father would be humiliated. If I stayed silent, we would lose everything anyway. I carried the papers to Mrs. Harper. She looked through each one carefully, her lips pressed tight. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "This ledger isn't just numbers," she said. "It's a confession written in ink." She set the papers down gently, as if they were alive. "You have two choices now. Expose the truth or protect your father's pride. Either way, you will lose something." I stared at the black lines running across the pages, the story of our undoing told in someone else's handwriting. My father had always warned me that the sea takes what it wants, but this wasn't the sea's doing. This was a man's, and somehow that made it worse. That week, everything around me seemed to sense the tension. The waves crashed harder against the rocks, the gulls screamed louder in the morning. Even Mrs. Harper noticed. "The sea mirrors the heart," she said. "Yours is preparing for a storm." I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I still met her by the shore each day, still traced words in the sand as the tide erased them. But my hands shook now, my thoughts scattered. The more I learned about reading, the more I understood that ignorance had been our only peace. Knowledge was heavy. It came with responsibility. And I could no longer bear to watch my father live under a lie. So I made a decision. If no one would believe our innocence, I would make them feel it. I began to write. At first, it was just a few sentences in the margins of old receipts, fragments of truth disguised as practice. But soon, the words took shape on full pages. I wrote about the smell of fish in the morning, about the calloused hands that built a life from water, about the quiet strength of a man who couldn't read the papers that condemned him. I wrote the truth of what we'd endured. Mrs. Harper read my pages silently one afternoon, the sea wind fluttering them in her hands. When she finished, she looked at me for a long time. "You've written something honest," she said softly. "And honesty frightens powerful men." I didn't understand what she meant then. Not fully. All I knew was that my words finally felt alive, breathing through the paper like waves against the shore. I couldn't publish it under my real name. My father would never forgive me. So I used a false one. Marin Hale, a name stolen from the sea itself. I mailed the story to a small publisher in the city, half hoping they would ignore it, half praying they wouldn't. The act felt like tossing a message in a bottle into the vast unknown. Fragile, foolish, desperate. Days turned into weeks. My father worked harder than ever, his silence deeper. The sea was unkind that season. The catches were small, the skies rough. Every evening I returned home exhausted, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if words could ever change anything. Then, one gray morning, a letter arrived addressed to Marin Hale. I nearly dropped it when I saw the city seal on the envelope. My hands trembled as I broke it open. It was short, just a few lines typed cleanly across the page. The first sentence thanked me for my submission. The second said they had read it with great interest. And the third froze my blood. "We want more," it said. 3 words, simple, harmless, yet they struck like lightning. Because if they wanted more, it meant my story had been heard. It also meant my secret was no longer mine to keep. As I stared at the letter, the waves outside grew louder, and for the first time, I wondered if truth itself could be as dangerous as the sea that raised me. I never thought my voice could travel beyond the sound of the sea, but that letter proved me wrong. The moment I read, "We want more," my world shifted, quiet but irreversible, like the tide pulling back before a storm. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the page, my heart racing with something between pride and fear. The girl who once traced letters in the sand had written something strangers wanted to read, and that realization terrified me as much as it set me free. The publisher's letter was simple, polite, and impossibly grand. They wanted me to expand the story, to tell more about life in the fishing village, the struggles, the storms, the losses. They said readers would feel moved by the authenticity. That word, authenticity, clung to me. To them, my life was a story. To me, it was survival. I walked to Mrs. Harper's cottage that same evening, the paper folded in my pocket, afraid to read it aloud. When she saw my face, she didn't need to ask. She took the letter, scanned the words, and smiled, not with surprise, but with quiet certainty. "You've given them truth," she said. "They always come for truth when they've run out of their own." She helped me write a reply. We didn't have proper stationery, just scraps of brown paper from old shipping boxes. My handwriting wavered, but my intent didn't. I agreed to write more, but under the same false name, Marin Hale. The name felt strange in my mouth, like a mask that both protected and silenced me. The publisher sent an advance payment, a sum so large I couldn't comprehend it. I'd never seen that much money, not even when the nets were full and the market kind. The check arrived folded inside an envelope, with a note that said, "For the continuation of your remarkable story." My breath caught as I held it. It felt like holding sunlight, warm, fragile, and dangerous. I couldn't tell my father. He'd see it as betrayal, as proof that I had chosen stories over the sea. So I lied. I told him I was helping Mrs. Harper organize her teaching records. I told him she paid me a little to copy her notes. He nodded, pretending not to care, but I could see the question in his eyes, the quiet unease of a man who knows something is changing, but doesn't yet understand. What? Days became weeks, and the story grew. I wrote about the village, about men who fought the sea and lost, about women who waited on the shore, about a girl who dreamed of words while her father drowned in silence. The writing came in waves, some gentle, some violent, but always honest. My grammar stumbled, my sentences tangled, but Mrs. Harper said that was what made them real. "You write the way you live," she told me, rough, raw, but unbroken. The publisher sent back my first draft with notes. They wanted emotion, detail, pain. They wanted to taste the salt in every paragraph. I gave them everything. I poured my father's hands into those pages, my mother's quiet strength, the smell of the docks at dawn, the cold weight of loss. Each word was a confession, and I didn't realize how much of myself I'd given away, until the story no longer felt like mine. When the manuscript was accepted, the publisher sent another letter, this one praising Marin Hale for capturing the soul of the forgotten. They called it the Tide Keeper. They said it would speak to thousands. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. To the world, it was fiction. To me, it was a wound turned into art. I hid the letters in a wooden box under my bed, alongside the first check, the forged documents, and the ashes of the book my father had burned. Each night before I slept, I'd touch the lid, half in gratitude, half in guilt. Mrs. Harper warned me, secrets are like tides. They always return. But I wasn't ready for what would come back to me. The first copies of the story arrived months later, bound, printed, beautiful. The Dawei cover bore the name Marin Hale in golden letters. I traced them slowly, remembering the first time I couldn't read at all. I thought I'd feel triumph, but instead I felt hollow. My name wasn't there, and neither was my father's. The world wanted the story, but it didn't want the truth behind it. Still, I couldn't stop. When the book began to sell, the publisher sent more money, more letters, more praise. They said I had a voice the world needed to hear, but the world didn't know that voice belonged to a girl who still lived by the tide, still washed her hands in salt water, still whispered prayers to the same sea that had taken everything. Then, one night, while the house slept, the wind turned violent. The shutters banged, the lamps flickered, and I lay awake listening to the waves hammering the shore. I heard footsteps outside my door, heavy, uneven. My heart froze as I sat up, the darkness alive with tension. The door opened. My father stepped inside, the lantern's light trembling in his hand. His face was pale, unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, one I recognized instantly by the city seal. He looked at me, the silence between us louder than any storm, and placed the letter on the table without a word. The firelight flickered across the publisher's crest stamped in blue wax. I opened my mouth to explain, to lie again, but the words died before they reached my lips. He turned toward the door, his shoulders heavy with something I couldn't name, and walked out into the night. The only sound left was the crash of waves, the sea calling after him, as if it too knew what I had done. The sea was roaring that night, louder than I had ever heard it, as if it were shouting the truth my father refused to speak. The air smelled of salt and sorrow, and the wind tore through the village like a living thing, furious and unstoppable. He had left before dusk, his shoulders squared, his silence sharper than any blade, carrying nothing but the lantern and the letter that had exposed my lie. I watched him from the window, his figure fading into the gray, and every instinct in me screamed to call him back. But pride kept my lips sealed, and pride is the cruelest companion when love is still trying to breathe. By the time I ran down to the shore, the tide had already turned savage. The waves rose high enough to swallow the moonlight. The boats pitched violently against their ropes. "He won't go far," one of the fishermen said, trying to calm me, but even he didn't believe his own words. My father's boat was small, meant for calm mornings, not nights like this. I could still see the faint glow of his lantern bobbing in the distance, swallowed a moment later by darkness. I waited on the docks for hours, my body soaked, the rain cutting across my skin. Each wave that crashed felt like punishment. I whispered prayers I didn't remember learning, bargains I couldn't keep. The wind answered with silence. The sea, my oldest enemy and oldest teacher, had turned against me once more. Mrs. Harper found me at dawn. She wrapped her shawl around my shoulders, but her eyes gave away what her mouth wouldn't say. The horizon was empty. No boat, no light, no sign of the man who had taught me how to fight the current. Only debris floated near the rocks, broken oars, a coil of rope, a single boot. When one of the younger fishermen shouted, I ran to him, my heart hammering, and saw it. A dark shape tangled in seaweed at the water's edge. My father's cap. Soaked, torn, unmistakable. I clutched it to my chest, my sobs drowned out by the crashing surf. For 3 days, I refused to leave the docks. The search boats went out and came back empty. The village women whispered that the sea had claimed him for daring to father a girl who betrayed her name. I didn't listen. I sat there until my hands turned white from the cold, staring at the horizon as though my will alone could pull him back. Every sound became a phantom of his voice, the snap of sails, the hiss of the tide, the whisper of my own breathing. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. The sky was pale, exhausted, the kind of color that follows too much rain. I went to Mrs. Harper's cottage because I couldn't bear the silence of our home. She poured tea. Neither of us drank. "The sea doesn't take without giving," she said softly, but I could see the doubt trembling at the edge of her faith. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that some debts are never repaid, but my throat felt full of water. That night, I returned home. The cottage still smelled of him, salt, smoke, and oil. His chair was empty, his boots by the door. I placed the torn cap beside the hearth and sat where he used to mend his nets. Guilt pressed against me until I could hardly breathe. My book was on the table, the copy he had found, the one that carried my false name. I opened it and ran my fingers over the printed words. They were mine, and yet they weren't. The success that had once felt like light now flickered like a dying candle. Sleep came only in fragments. I dreamed of waves shaped like hands pulling him away, of letters dissolving in seawater, of voices shouting my name from beneath the surface. When I woke, the room was filled with the sound of dripping water. For a terrifying moment, I thought the sea had broken in, but it was only rain slipping through a crack in the roof. The wind had shifted. Morning was coming. Then came the knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, too deliberate to be the wind. I opened it to find one of the fishermen standing there, his face drawn, his cap pressed against his chest. Behind him, the world was gray and still, the kind of stillness that follows a storm's victory. He didn't speak at first. He just held out something wrapped in an oilcloth. My hands shook as I unwrapped it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, creased and water-stained, but unmistakably written in my father's hand. My knees gave way, and I sank to the floor as the fisherman whispered, "We found it in the nets, near the inlet. It's addressed to you." The ink was blurred, the edges torn, but his handwriting cut through the damage with a painful clarity. My name stared back at me, the letters uneven but unmistakable. I held it against my chest, terrified to open it, terrified not to. The waves outside had fallen silent, as if waiting for me to breathe. And in that heavy stillness, I understood that whatever words lay inside were not just my father's farewell. They were the key to the next storm my life would have to face. I held the letter so tightly that the edges cut into my skin, as if the paper wanted to bleed with me. The ink had run in places, the words swollen from the sea's touch, but my father's handwriting was still unmistakable, bold, certain, even in its trembling lines. I read the first sentence, and the air seemed to vanish from the room. He had written it the night before the storm, knowing he might not return. My eyes burned as I saw his confession unfold. A man trying to speak through water and time, a father trying to reach his daughter one last time. The first line was an apology. He wrote that he had known about my book all along. He had found the first letter from the publisher weeks before he confronted me, but couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He said he had read the parts he could, not the words, but the emotion behind them, and understood that they were born from love, not rebellion. He was proud, he said, but ashamed that it had taken the world's approval for him to see me. His handwriting faltered near the end, the ink darker, heavier. "Keep writing," he wrote. "Even if I don't return. Let your words become the boat that carries what's left of me." I pressed the letter to my chest, my sobs breaking through the walls. Outside, the sea answered with its own voice, deep, relentless, ancient. I ran to the shore, barefoot, still clutching the letter, and screamed his name into the wind. The tide rose around me, cold and wild, carrying back my echo like thunder rolling through the cliffs. For the first time in my life, I screamed not at the sea, but with it, our grief becoming one sound that neither of us could silence. Days turned to weeks, and the letter became my anchor. I read it each morning, the paper softer, the ink fading, but the meaning growing stronger. The pain did not leave. It reshaped itself into something that demanded to be used. I wrote again, not for the publisher this time, but for him. Every page became a conversation between the girl who had hidden her words and the father who had finally learned to hear them. When the book was published, the world began to whisper my name. It started slowly, a mention in a newspaper, a photograph printed without my face, just my hands resting on a table beside the sea. Then came the reviews, the letters from readers who said they saw their own fathers in my story, who said my words had helped them forgive. They called the writing honest, raw, transformative. They called Maren Hale a new voice of the forgotten coast. They didn't know that voice had been born from guilt and love, and a grief that never slept. The money came again, and this time, I didn't hide it. I repaired the cottage roof, bought new nets for the few fishermen left, and funded lessons for girls who wanted to read. The village began to change. The same people who once whispered curses now nodded with quiet respect when I passed. Mrs. Harper watched all this with tired eyes, proud but cautious. Fame is just another tide, she warned me. It lifts you high enough to forget how deep the water really is. I smiled, but her words followed me like shadows. The publisher wrote to say they wanted a sequel, something more polished, more dramatic. I stared at the letter for hours, wondering if I was strong enough to reopen the wound. But my father's words whispered back, "Keep writing." And so I did. Every new chapter felt like lighting a candle for him, keeping the memory alive, feeding the sea with stories instead of tears. Months passed in a blur of work and ink. The Tidekeeper spread across towns and cities, translated into languages I couldn't read. People wanted to know who Maren Hale really was. I gave interviews through letters, always careful to guard the truth. My anonymity became a kind of power, faceless, untraceable, safe. But the more my story traveled, the more dangerous that safety became. It began with a single article in a coastal newspaper. The headline read, "Who is Maren Hale, and did she steal her story?" I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. But then came the letters, from strangers, from journalists, from readers, asking if the rumor was true. Someone was claiming that Maren Hale wasn't real, that the story had been stolen from another writer entirely. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My hands went cold. I went to Mrs. Harper, clutching the article. Her face darkened as she read it. "They're testing you," she said, but her voice trembled. "The higher the tide, the harder it tries to pull you under." She told me not to answer, not to let the noise drown me. But I could see something else in her eyes. Fear. Days later, another letter arrived. This one didn't come from the publisher. It was handwritten, unmarked, slipped under my door at dawn. My name, my real name, was written on the front in perfect, deliberate penmanship. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the chill rise through my spine. When I opened it, the words were few, but deadly precise. "You tell the world the story was yours, but we both know who really wrote it." No signature, no hint of who it was from. Just the echo of a truth I didn't yet understand. A threat rising. From the deep, like a wave I couldn't see coming. And as I stood there, clutching the letter, the sea outside began to roar again, as if it already knew that my next battle would not be against the ocean, but against the ghosts it had left behind. The morning the journalist called, the sky was gray and heavy, as if the sea itself had crept up to listen. His voice came through the crackling line, polite but sharp. carrying a question that sliced through the calm I'd built. "Is it true that Mrs. Harper wrote The Tidekeeper for you?" For a moment, the world tilted. The floor seemed to sway like a boat caught in rough water. My chest turned to stone. The woman who had taught me to read, who had saved me from silence, was now being painted as my ghostwriter. And I could not tell if the world had gone mad or if it had simply turned its eyes toward me at last. I tried to answer, but the words refused to leave my throat. The journalist filled the silence himself, explaining that a local paper had printed an anonymous letter claiming Mrs. Harper had written the story years ago, that I had simply copied her lessons and sent them to the publisher as my own. I felt the air leave my body. The article was spreading fast, he said, picked up by city outlets, readers demanding a statement. The line buzzed in my ear long after he hung up, leaving me alone in a room that suddenly felt too small for the truth I held. Within a day, the village was divided. Some believed me, the people who had seen me grow, who had watched me sit on the pier scribbling words while the tide lapped at my feet. Others whispered that I was ungrateful, that I had stolen not just the sea's stories, but the heart of the woman who gave me language itself. In the marketplace, voices lowered when I passed. Children stopped calling my name. My book, once their pride, now sat untouched on the shelf of the small shop near the docks. I wrote to Mrs. Harper immediately. 3 letters in one night, my handwriting frantic and uneven. I begged her to speak, to tell the truth, to silence the storm before it drowned us both. Days passed. No reply. The silence from her cottage echoed louder than any accusation. Even the sea seemed to hesitate outside her door, its usual rhythm replaced by something uncertain, watchful. My publisher called next. Their tone was different now. Careful, cautious, the way people speak when they're calculating damage. "We need to clarify ownership," they said. "If Mrs. Harper claims authorship, we must protect ourselves, legally." I hung up before they finished. My hands were shaking so badly that the papers I held fluttered to the ground like frightened birds. Fame had turned its back faster than I could blink. The same world that had lifted me up now wanted to tear me down, piece by piece, rumor by rumor. I went to the shore that night, where the wind howled against the rocks. I shouted her name into the storm, the same way I had once shouted for my father. My voice cracked, the wind swallowed it, and still, she did not come. The next morning I walked to her cottage, desperate for answers. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its roof sagging, the smoke from the chimney faint. I knocked. No answer. I called her name again. Still nothing. The door creaked open under my hand. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and tea. Books were stacked along the walls, some covered in dust, others marked with her neat handwriting. On the table sat a single open notebook, its ink still wet. My name filled the first line. Not the name Marin Hale, but my real one. Beneath it, she had written a sentence that made my knees give way. "I never wrote her story. I only taught her how to find her voice." I sank into her chair, shaking, my tears falling onto the page. She had been defending me in silence all along, letting the storm batter her name so that mine could survive. I wanted to run to her, to tell her I was sorry for doubting, sorry for believing the world's noise over her quiet faith. But when I looked toward her bedroom door, I saw that it was closed, and something inside me broke. The next hours blurred. The villagers arrived, drawn by the rumor that I'd gone to confront her. Some watched from the path, their faces pale with curiosity, others whispering prayers. A fisherman told me she hadn't been seen in days, that she'd fallen ill after the last storm, but refused to call for help. The truth settled in my chest like ice. I had been too late. The accusations had found her before I did. I left the cottage with her notebook clutched to my chest, the ink still damp where her hand had last moved. The villagers stared as I passed, their whispers chasing me down the path. but I didn't hear them. The only sound in my ears was the sea, low, endless, unrelenting, repeating her words like a prayer. I never wrote her story. And when I reached the shore, I looked up at the sky and swore that I would finish what she started, no matter what it cost me, even if the truth buried me with her. When I finally saw her again, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, thinner, her once steady hands trembling as she reached for mine. But her eyes, those fierce, unyielding eyes, still burned with the same quiet fire that had once guided me through the darkness of ignorance. The world had taken so much from her, yet she sat there as if she still owned the patience of the sea itself. "I told them you wrote it," she said before I could speak. "But they need a villain to make you interesting." The words cut through the air like a blade wrapped in tenderness. I couldn't hold back the tears. Seeing her alive was both a blessing and a punishment. I had come prepared to apologize, to fall to my knees if I had to, but her calmness disarmed me completely. She motioned for me to sit beside her on the small wooden bench outside her cottage. The wind carried the scent of salt and smoke, the same smell that had surrounded our first lesson by the sea. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic breathing of the ocean below the cliffs, like the world itself was eavesdropping. She reached for a notebook resting on her lap, its leather cracked and worn from years of use. "I kept this," she said softly. "For you." I hesitated before taking it. The cover was familiar, the same kind she used when teaching me to write my first sentences. Inside, the pages were filled with my earliest attempts at language: crooked letters, broken words, half-finished sentences. She had copied them in her own handwriting, preserving every mistake, every fragile step forward. "I copied them," she explained, her voice trembling, "because one day I knew you'd forget how far you came. The world moves fast when it starts to see you. I wanted to leave proof, not for them, but for you, that every word was yours before it was anyone's." The tears came harder then. I wept for her, for the time I'd doubted her, for my father who'd died believing that silence was strength, for the sea that had taken him and yet somehow kept sending me lessons in return. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch as steady as ever. "You must understand," she said. "Truth frightens people who've built their lives on lies. When they can't discredit your words, they'll try to erase your witnesses. That's why I said nothing, because sometimes silence protects better than noise." Her words broke something in me: the guilt, the shame, the weight of everything I'd carried since my father's death. I realized then that she had been shielding me all along, bearing the burden of the world's doubt, so that my voice could survive. And still, she asked for nothing in return. We sat there until the sky began to darken, the horizon glowing faintly red, the same shade the water turns before a storm. I wanted to tell her everything I'd never said, how I had written to her every night after the accusations, how I had feared the world more than the sea, how I had almost given up. But when I opened my mouth, the words dissolved into sobs. She only smiled. "You don't have to explain," she said. "You already did, in the book." Then, with a weak laugh, she added, "Do you know what your father used to tell me when you first began learning? He'd stand by the fence and watch you struggle with the alphabet and say, 'She's going to build a world with those letters, and I hope she builds one that can survive storms.' He was right." I froze. The sound of his name spoken aloud again made the world tilt. "You knew my father came to see you?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "He came once, after you learned to read. He thanked me, said he didn't understand it, but that he could see light in your eyes when you held a book. I promised him I'd keep teaching you, even if he couldn't bear to watch." The sea roared in the distance, and I felt something shift inside me. A mix of gratitude and grief so deep it was almost unbearable. I opened the notebook again, running my fingers across the old pages. There, in her careful, looping script, were my childish words, my first sentences about the sea, my fear of the waves, my longing to understand. She had kept every one of them. I turned page after page, each one a mirror of who I had been, until I reached the very last. The paper looked different, newer, thicker, added recently. At the top, I saw Mrs. Harper's handwriting again, for her next chapter. Beneath it, however, the ink changed. The letters were familiar, not hers. My breath caught. The handwriting was my father's. For a moment I couldn't move. The lines were faint, but unmistakable. His strong, deliberate strokes spelling words I hadn't seen since the letter he'd left me before the storm. My hands began to shake as I read the first few words. If she finds this, tell her the truth about the debt. My pulse thundered in my ears. I looked up at Mrs. Harper, her face pale against the darkening sky, and she whispered, "He left you more than a letter, child. He left you the reason for everything." The waves below crashed harder, and I knew the sea was about to deliver one final secret it had been keeping all along. My father's note in that notebook began with a line that felt like both a command and a blessing. "Tell them who we were, not just who you became." The words trembled in my hands, alive with his spirit, echoing all the years he had kept silent while teaching me strength without ever speaking it aloud. When I read them, the world seemed to slow. The sea outside quieter, its voice no longer angry but patient, like it had been waiting for me to finally understand. I returned to the shore that day. The waves soft now, whispering instead of roaring, carrying my father's words through the foam like they had been there all along. Mrs. Harper watched from the cliff above as I knelt by the water, notebook open on my lap. I traced the line with my finger, whispering it over and over until it became a prayer. The tide slid over my feet, cool and forgiving, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear, only belonging. I realized then that every storm, every loss, every accusation had been a current pushing me toward this moment. I opened my next manuscript with that same line. Tell them who we were. The words became my compass. The story that followed wasn't about fame or success. It wasn't about the book that made the world whisper my name. It was about the people who taught me what it meant to have one. A father who found redemption in silence, a teacher who fought lies with patience, and a sea that took everything only to give it back in a different form. I wrote for days, barely stopping to eat, each sentence flowing like tidewater, each memory reshaping itself into something luminous. I wrote about the first time I held a book, the smell of salt and paper mixing like fate, about my father's laughter, rare and raw, about Mrs. Harper's hands guiding mine across sand, teaching me that every mistake was a step toward clarity. I wrote about the ledger, the lies, the forgiveness. Every wound became a word, and every word healed something I hadn't realized was still bleeding. When I finished, the manuscript felt alive, pulsing with the voices of the people I loved. I didn't send it to the publisher right away. Instead, I carried it to the same dock where I had first watched my father sail out to sea. The planks creaked under my weight, the wind gentle, the air thick with memory. I placed the new book beside the first one, The Tide Keeper, the story that had started it all. The covers touched side by side, as if they belonged to the same heartbeat. I stayed there until sunset, watching the light fade across the water. Every shimmer on the surface looked like a fragment of the past, moments breaking apart, then rejoining again in rhythm. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Villagers, children, the sound of laughter carried by the breeze. The same people who once doubted me now brought their daughters to learn to read, their sons to hear my stories. It felt like the village itself had learned a new language, one built not on fear, but on remembrance. Mrs. Harper joined me at the dock, her shawl fluttering in the wind. "You did what he asked," she said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak, because the truth of it pressed too hard against my chest. She smiled, that small, knowing smile that always carried both pride and goodbye. He would have loved this ending, she whispered. He would have said the sea finally learned your name. The waves lapped at the dock, gentle and rhythmic. I closed my eyes, listening, not for storms this time, but for peace. Somewhere in that endless hum, I could almost hear my father's voice, soft and certain, repeating the words that had started it all. Keep writing. I stood, wiped my tears, and turned to leave. Behind me, the sea stretched out like a page waiting for its next story. And that's when I heard it. The light sound of footsteps, smaller than mine, quick and curious. I turned and saw her. A young girl standing near the books, her hair tangled by the wind, her bare feet wet with salt water. She picked up the top book, running her fingers over the cover as if it were something sacred. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the same hunger I'd once carried, and asked in a voice barely louder than the waves, "Will you teach me to read?" For a moment, time folded. Past and present, merging like tide and shore. I smiled through the ache in my throat, kneeling so we were eye to eye. "Yes," I whispered. "But this time, you'll learn faster. Because now, the sea already knows the words." The tide touched the dock, carrying the sound away, and I realized that stories never end. They only change readers. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Tell me in the comments, which part of her journey moved you the most? Your one click, one word, one thought keeps these stories alive, like waves that never stop. Subscribe for more untold voices, more journeys that begin where silence ends.